We'll be starting here in the next 2 minutes, I'd say. Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Shoemate with Construction Employers Association. We will now begin our webinar for today. I want to thank everyone for finding time to attend today's webinar. I want to remind members that the COVID-19 web page is being continuously updated. There were a couple of other updates of guidance and information this week. So I encourage you to please continue to view that. We also ask that participants mute their phones and/or computer audio if you haven't already done so. There are opportunities to ask questions. There is a chat box that we field or take questions from. If you're on your PC, there's a little bubble, I think in the upper right hand, where you can send a chat or a specific question should you have one. Stacy Lawler, I know you have lots of questions, so be nice to us. But we want to thank Hahn Lozier staff and associates for their continued support of CEA and the industry. They are our presenters for today, and our topic is, as we see on the screen, documenting and prosecuting COVID-19 delays. There are 3 or 4 presenters and other staff that are participating today. So again, I want to thank you and turn it over to, I believe, Aaron to get us started.
Glenn, it's actually Rob Remington, I think, that's going to kick it off here. And I want to thank you and Courtney and the Construction Employers Association for having us present today. On behalf of Hahn Lozier and myself, I'm pleased that Aaron Evanchak, my partner and colleague in the construction practice group, is with us. Most of you know Aaron, a long-standing member of the construction bar, well known in the industry, and has his degree in civil engineering from Ohio State. We also have Jeff Rush and Chad Van Arnhem today, who are presenting with us. Jeff is the director of our construction services group, and Chad is a senior project manager in that group. They are an example of our unique practice. They're both industry professionals, not lawyers, that work with us and bring their experience. I think last time I looked, between the two of them, over 40 years of project experience to our practice at Hahn Lozier. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. I should also thank Aaron Hawk, who is our director of marketing and helps put these programs together, and is the Aaron that you're hearing us ask to advance the slides during the course of this presentation. Encourage all of you to log on to, sign up for our construction blog. We've had it for some time now. We keep it updated very regularly with trends and updates with respect to the construction industry. Obviously, there's a lot going on right now with the COVID stuff. It's very up to date with respect to those issues, particularly as it relates to the legal issues that we're all facing going forward during this pandemic. Aaron, you can advance. So our agenda today is pretty straightforward. I'm going to kick off just generally by talking about protecting your company and protecting your projects in this sort of COVID-19 period. And then I'm going to turn it over to really talk about specifics with respect to project delays, tracking, and the prosecution of claims with Aaron, Jeff, and Chad. Aaron, you can go ahead and advance. So I kind of have broken my presentation down into 2 parts. First, what should I expect? And we're 2 months into this now, and I think if there's one thing we're all seeing is really every situation is different. This is a very fluid situation, and so the answer really, unfortunately, is it really depends on so many variables. There are so many moving parts where the shutdowns are occurring, what are the local guidelines, local orders, what are the local restrictions. You know, even just literally moments before this program started, for those of you who availed yourselves to the payroll protection loans, the government just issued a notice that, and as most of you know, the safe harbor deadline for giving the money back if your certifications were inappropriate is tomorrow. Just under the deadline, the government now has told us, one, that all loans under $2 million, they're going to deem the certifications as being appropriate. I think you've all probably heard by now that everything over $2 million is going to be audited. But I think most important with respect to this issue is the government's also said there's not going to be a penalty if you're audited and it's determined that your certification was inappropriate or the government deems it to have not been correct. The only penalty is repayment of the funds, which I think is important news for people coming up to the safe harbor deadline to kind of know and have some comfort level, at least, that the worst case scenario in the situation where your certification is deemed inappropriate is repayment of the funds. But it just goes to the fact that every situation is really different, and the entire situation is very dynamic right now and continues to be. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. So the next part of my presentation is what could we expect? And what I'm telling people, what I'm sure a lot of you have heard, is you need to plan for the worst and hope for the best. You're getting conflicting reports coming out every day. Recently, the AIA index pointed to a major downturn. The Associated Builders and Contractors chief economist forecasted a steep decline. We need to plan for the worst. And that means, I think, implementing a number of at least general business guidelines to help plan for the potential of a serious situation over an extended period of time. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. Actually, you can skip the next slide, Aaron, if you want. In the interest of kind of moving things along. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. I'm sorry, Aaron, go back one, I'm sorry. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of protecting your company, and some of these things you're obviously already done or have thought about, but I think they're worth going back over. One is the stimulus loan. If you did get a payroll, a PPP loan, you need to really evaluate how to maximize the forgiveness of that loan. There are lots of programs out there. A number of our business people have been giving them. We would encourage you to look at those and really understand and talk to your professionals with respect to how can I maximize and make sure that I'm going to have the most amount of my loan forgiven. Main Street Lending Program, you're hearing more and more about that. That's a follow-on lending opportunity. Aaron, if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that for a second. So the Main Street Lending Program, and I'm going to give you the caveat right now that you have a construction lawyer talking to you about lending. And I stole this slide from one of our tax lawyers' presentations, but I thought it was important to put in to this presentation just to make sure that you're aware of it, because as part of the whole concept of maintaining your cash flow and making sure that you've got the cash you need, this lending facility is something that you should keep in mind. It is not forgivable, but it has, as you can see in the slide, a number of very reasonable, terms. It gives you the opportunity to borrow up to, and there's a formula, but it's essentially up to $25 million. And I understand that this can be obtained in addition to the fact that you may have a PPP loan. So something to keep in mind. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. The other aspects of just implementing a cash flow management plan and really watching the impact on your cash flow. Some pretty basic but aspects of your business that deserve to be reinforced. And you're going to hear this from all of us. A lot of this is just reinforcing, focusing, enhancing your view on a number of basic business issues. Aggressive collections, looking at your aged receivables, putting a plan in place to pursue those and enhance your focus on those aspects of your business now. And it's a practice that I think for a lot of our clients, we're seeing, you know, as they implement these procedures in a crisis, they're best practices to carry on well beyond the end of this crisis and into normal business. Extend payables and conserve cash. Look at places where you don't need to be making payments. Where can you conserve cash? And implement a plan to make sure that you're, again, enhancing your focus on doing that during these times. Next slide, Aaron. More of, I'm sorry, Aaron, I may have pushed you one too many. Go back one. There we go. Again, part of going down to the basics, how do we make money in this industry as contractors? We make progress on projects. So your focus needs to be keeping that progress moving forward, keeping those projects moving forward. Enhance tracking receivables, pay application requirements, lien waivers. Make sure that everything's in order, goes in, and that you're not delayed you know, with respect to being paid on a project. Pursue timely or even early release of retention, regardless of what your contract may say. If your project is going well and it's 75% done, ask for some retention to be released if it's not being released. If you have the right under your contract, well, make sure that you're focused on what rights you have with respect to the release of retention, and go and make sure that those releases are happening and that cash is coming in. Pursue timely lien and bond rights, and you all hear about this from us continuously in the programs that we give, but now is the time again to have an enhanced focus on this. The only way to absolutely ensure and give yourself the best possible opportunity to recover is to make sure that you enforce those rights. And as I say to people in every presentation we give on this, there is virtually no other aspect of the law in the United States or in the state of Ohio that allows you to put a lien on somebody's property with absolutely no due process whatsoever. We have it in this industry, we have the right to do it, and it's absolutely crucial, particularly in these times, that we avail ourselves of that right and make sure that we're protecting that right. Strictly enforce your pay provisions. We are lucky here in the state of Ohio, at least, you know, to the extent that you are a upstream contractor, because you have the right to enforce pay provisions. Make sure that the appropriate provisions are in your contracts and make sure that you're enforcing those. And then finally, minimize scope creep. Where you might have let something go in the past, you should enhance your focus on, is that something I should let go? Do I need to tighten this down? Do I need to make sure that scope is not creeping? And if it's going to, make sure that I'm getting compensated for it. Next slide, Aaron. Reliable supply and labor, crucial. You know, I'm hearing long-term things are expected to be okay, that those supply chains will where there are issues, improve. But it is clear that some companies are better prepared than others. And you need to know and have an enhanced focus on which ones are and which ones aren't that you are working with. Make sure that you have a workforce labor plan in place and you have alternates with respect to how you're going to deal with those issues if there's a shortage or a problem. Now is the time to scrutinize your key suppliers. Are they able to meet supply requirements? What are the risks? You know, I think it's important for any supplier that is crucial to a project or your business that now is the time where you may not have in the past say, I need to have some visibility with respect to what you're doing. I need to look at and understand your inventory, your production, and your ability to fulfill any purchase order. And you need to understand, are you a priority? And if you're not, then you need to evaluate whether or not you need to have and implement alternative plans for key suppliers. Those are crucial issues. And again, a lot of it is common sense, but it comes down to just putting a plan in place to make sure that you're being proactive and that you're preempting any potential problems. And Aaron, you can go to my next slide, which is really the main point here, which is predict, preempt shortages, and then I'm really reminding clients, look, where you have any concern or even any suggestion that there are issues, don't wait. Immediately investigate slowdowns, look at material suppliers, and understand their viability and your vulnerability. Okay, Aaron, you can go to the next slide. So the other aspect in these times that I think is important to be thinking about when you're just talking about protecting your business, protecting your cash flow, is really looking at the projects in the backlog that you have. Vulnerable or unfamiliar owners, do you need to demand adequate assurance? I'm in the middle right now, just came up with a major casino project, in Maryland. And needless to say, those projects are unbelievably volatile and vulnerable right now because of what's going on. And if, my clients who are on those kinds of projects, we need to really seriously look at those projects and evaluate where we are and evaluate what our rights are, because you just don't know what's going to happen. But you have the right to demand financial assurance where you have concerns. And it's something you need to evaluate. You should evaluate with your professional and where appropriate and necessary, do it to make sure that you're not on a project with a burn rate going on where you may never recover that, or it may take you years to recover it in a situation where you really can't afford that. Evaluate and understand project suspension rights. If it looks like you're going to have issues on a project, make sure you look at your contract. What are my rights to terminate as a contractor if I don't feel comfortable, or suspend the project? If I feel like I may be terminated for convenience, what are my obligations? What are my rights with respect to that? What are my obligations and what are my rights downstream to my subcontractors and my material suppliers? Are there major supply purchases that are coming down the road that I might not be able to return? And do I need to, am I going to want to undertake those purchases if I'm not really sure where the project is going or how compensation is going to work? Those are all kinds of things that really need to have an enhanced focus right now on your projects to protect your project and protect your company. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. And then finally, before I turn this over to Aaron Evanchik, I'm going to talk a little bit about claims, but not claims from the perspective of delay claims with respect to the question we're getting, which is, how liable am I if I have an infected worker, or if I have the virus spread throughout my workforce? And the answer that we are giving to people is, one, we're not really sure yet. A lot's going to depend on the jurisdiction you happen to be in. But what we are sure about is there are certain things that you can control to put yourself in the best possible position. And the most important is to make sure that you are complying with all of the local government and state orders with respect to safe workplace. Make sure that you're documenting the fact that you are complying with those safety measures. Make sure that if someone does contract an illness or the virus on a project or in your office, that you strictly follow and show that you're following the CDC guidelines, including, they got to be sent home and home for at least 15 days. CDC is requiring someone infected be contact traced to understand who they've been in contact with, and those people notified, and those people also quarantined. Full compliance in this regard, I think, is key to making sure that you avoid potential liability, both liability in terms of for not having a safe work environment, but also liability with respect to your workforce. it's crucial. You want your workforce to be healthy, capable, and the worst thing that could happen is that the virus spreads throughout a group and shuts them completely down for an extended period of time. So strict compliance and documentation of strict compliance is crucial to avoid those potential issues down the road. And with that, that's my last slide, and I'm going to turn this program over to Aaron Evanchik. I'm sorry I went quick, but we got a lot to cover. We'll be available to answer questions. I guess my last slide here is just keep an eye on the state website. It changes all the time. You can look at that to make sure that you're complying at least with what the state of Ohio has out there. And again, make sure that you're keeping a file with respect to those issues. So down the road, you can show and document that you've continued to have full compliance.
Rob,
Aaron,
Rob, one comment or question. There's, I guess, conversation, if you will, at Congress regarding liability protection for employers as relates to, any protecting their workers. And, the government is basically saying employers must protect workers and be held accountable. And, there's different sides of the aisle, I think, that are suggesting that this is litigation heaven. Any perspective to that type of public sentiment or comment or political comment?
It's just a great point, Glenn, which is, and it's just part of this whole issue that, even with the, basically everything that's happening right down to the stimulus loans, it is a moving target. Politics are coming into play now. And those issues, what I'm saying to our clients is those issues are out of our control to some degree, to a large degree. But what's not out of our control is the regulations, the guidelines, the requirements that are in place. Following those strictly and documenting it is really the most we can do right now to make sure that we're limiting any potential exposure down the road.
Sure. I know there was a hearing yesterday at the Senate, and they had representatives, both labor and business, who were, I think, both in agreement that enforceable rules would give workers recourse and also provide employers with kind of defense, but there needed to be some degree of, rule certainty. And there's, again, debate about the level of government intervention in that process. So again, just from a news standpoint, just thought I would interject that.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's consistent with really everything that's been happening.
Sure. Thank you, Rob.
Great. And Aaron Evanchik, I think
Hi.
you're.
Yep. Hey everybody, you guys can hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. So first, I want to tell everybody what you listened to from Rob just now. Even if Corona didn't exist, those are all excellent practices that you should be putting into place for your companies to ensure you know what's going on and have your finger on the pulse of where the cash is moving. So what Rob said is phenomenal, and listen to it. Glenn, in one of the concepts I'm going to talk about, if you want to jump a slide here, Aaron, is that balance, right? How do you balance out the fear? One more. How do you balance out the fear that everybody has? One more, Aaron, please. One more. Start with the one that owners are saying. There you go. Perfect. How do you balance out this fear of everybody wanting to open up their office with the fear of a major lawsuit coming? So on one hand, if you don't provide that guidance, those who are opening offices are going to be scared to do so out of fear that, well, I might get sued if I don't take everybody's temperature correctly, or if I don't respond, or somebody's 5.5 feet instead of 6 feet and I don't enforce that. Am I opening up to myself to a wrongful death lawsuit? So that's going to slow an economic recovery versus giving people immunity from some of these lawsuits, just like we give immunity to certain industries that do things, so that we know we can open up and encourage it, and know as a society we're taking that risk. Those are decisions that luckily I don't have to make. But as we go through some of this, and Rob and I and Chad and Jeff and others have lectured to a lot of different industries about this, lots of different groups in the construction real estate world. One of the things I keep mentioning, and I mention it every time, is that there needs to be some sort of Corona compromise where all the industry groups come together and say, here's how this pain should be spread in a way. Here's the pain that the general contractors and subcontractors should take. Here's the pain the lenders should take. Here's the pain the government should take. Here's the pain the owners should take, the surety should take, so that everybody knows what they're doing and everybody knows that they're taking a piece of this. We're all contributing. Nobody wants to take it all on, but everyone's willing to take some piece of it. And that's the sense I'm getting from our clients. So I'm going to focus on, I'm going to try to do it quickly because I do want you to hear from Chad and Jeff on calculating some of these things. The two perspectives. Number one is Corona slowing things down. You're not able to work as efficiently as you're able to work, and we're going to talk about why. So does that excuse your performance? Can we argue, as you see on here, force majeure? I can't get things done as quickly. I have to keep people socially distant. I have to provide sinks and hand washing stations. I have to make sure we stop on the way in and take everybody's temperature. Even to get into our building in the office, there's a whole queue, 1 or 2 people in the elevator time. Imagine you're trying to work up a lift to deliver materials up to the top of the building, and you're limited how many people can go in at once, or workers at the top of the building, how many people can go in at once. All that slows things down. Does this excuse that time? I think certainly it does. Under any force majeure provision, I think any jury, judge, or arbitrator is going to say it does. But who's entitled to compensation for that time? These are the things that we need to focus on. Most of you who are listening probably are contractors or subcontractors. I can see your names, as I know who a lot of you are. And so you're looking for both time and money. There may be contract provisions that give you time only, and you want to battle about money. So this is our focus. So what are owners saying? Owners are looking at their force majeure clauses, and they're trying to say to contractors, look, I understand it might take a little more time. I'm willing to give you time, but I'm not willing to pay money. Is it always possible to move on? We're going to talk about the impossibility of performance doctrine. One other thing we're seeing are people who were struggling to perform anyways, using this as an excuse. And the final thought I have on this slide is when you see crews, and we were seeing this more 30 days ago than we're seeing now, although I do think it's become ripe again with the reopening of Ohio and people moving around, and sadly how this has become a political issue where the wearing or not wearing of a mask is somehow viewed as a political ideology or statement rather than a safety mechanism, where if this re-erupts again and the number of cases starts to rise again, and you have people who refuse to come to work, if their refusal is despite the fact that you're making everybody wear masks and everybody's distancing 6 feet away, I ask, are you smarter than Amy Acton? Dr. Acton says that we can be this 6-foot socially spaced and we can keep these things on, and yet you still refuse to come. What do you know that she doesn't? And the flip is that if you do have crews refuse to come, or because they are legitimately sick, or they have family members who are sick and they've now quarantined themselves, is that excusable? If you've got a crew working out in an apartment building, say the one at Public Square, and God forbid that there's a balloon in there and everybody gets sick, is it excusable for that crew not to be able to come? Can you hold that subcontractor, say your drywall subcontractor, responsible for the fact that they don't show up, or they excused? I'd argue under force majeure, they're excused. They couldn't prevent everyone from getting sick, but maybe a general contractor said they should have done more to prevent everyone from getting sick. We saw a safety requirement come out of one of the bigger general contractors in the industry that required, if you're working within 6 feet, you have a mask, you have a face shield, you have double gloves, and you have a surgical gown on. I don't even know where you can get that stuff today, let alone wear it and be productive. So there's still a lot of unknowns. Let's jump to the next slide, please. So what are the impacts? What are the things that are going to slow you down? First, as we said, social distancing, being forced to hand wash and sanitize. All of these things slow your efficiency. It's something that Jeff and Chad are going to talk about, how we measure our loss of efficiency, oftentimes using a measured mile formula. Who has to pay for these costs? Well, that's going to be the big kicker. When Glenn said there's going to be a lot of litigation, these costs add up and people aren't willing to sit down and fairly apportion them. There is going to be a lot of litigation over these things, and that's going to be unfortunate. Crew absences, sickness and quarantine, slowed performance. If your crew can't show up, if you have a drywall sub that says, I can't show up, we think it's unsafe to work, and they cite to a force majeure provision, but you can call 3 other drywall contractors who are willing to be there. Well, that shows it's not an act of God force majeure preventing it. It's their lack of desire to do it. Jump to the next slide. So what do owners, if you're a contractor, general contractor, or subcontractor, and you're pushing these claims up through, what are you concerned about? we are concerned about, is there cash to pay for all these things? ODOT's taken some positions, and ODOT I look at as one of the leaders in the industry. They seem to set the tone. They're probably one of the biggest public owners in Ohio when it comes to construction projects. And they've said they think these things are excusable delays, but not compensable delays. And I know I'm going to be battling on that. But one of the things that we're now seeing is because the state has cut budgets so tremendously, there's less money going to all public owners, colleges, ODOT, Ohio agencies, that if you're hitting this along with an extra claim, you're going to find that there's a lack of project funds or contingency funds to pay for this. So in those instances, you might look at telling an owner, look, terminate me for convenience, pay for what's been done so far, and let's get out of this before we're forced to go do more work and incur these costs that nobody has money to pay for. Next slide. On private projects, there's lots of team players. You got the lender who risked a project being out of balance. As Rob said, imagine you were lending on a casino project. Now suddenly we have no idea when people are going to be allowed to back in casinos or consumer confidence will be up. You can apply the same thing to apartment projects, to retail projects. Suddenly those projects come in with a lower appraisal and are out of balance, quote unquote, loan out of balance. Who has the money to refix that so their equities are readjusted, right? Most loans, you have to keep some amount of equity, say 20% in the deal, and suddenly the project value drops. The lender says to the owner, put money back in the deal. These owners are getting a delay in completion, and when rents start, future tenants are waiting to move in, but suddenly have to pay more rent to their current place or can't start their business. Who is going to pay for all these? Again, right now it's every man for himself until we have this fair compromise. And I urge all these industry groups to get together on one of these sessions and let's come up with a fair Corona compromise. Who has to do what? Next slide. Impossibility of performance. Impossibility excuses your performance. If you cannot move forward because of unforeseen events that arise, rendering impossible performance, you can use that to excuse your performance. Again, if a crew, despite all of your best efforts and following all of these things, gets sick and can't perform, you to argue impossibility of performance. Next slide. We have a slightly lower one, impracticability of performance. A Mary Poppins word, a big word. That means here that despite all of your reasonable efforts, the performance isn't practicable in spite of your efforts. So we can do all of these things. We can do the social 6-foot distance, and we do all these things, but the fact is the project requires people to work so closely together in such a confined space without air movement, there's no safe way of doing it. Here, impracticability of performance might excuse performance. So let's jump to the next slide. Jump to, please, the contract provisions. So what are the contract provisions that are govern this? Number one, as I said, force majeure, and you got to read that carefully. There's some states that imply a force majeure, a suspension. And here's the tug of war we were seeing at the beginning of this, and we're still seeing. On the one hand, contractors were struggling to perform, and they wanted to argue force majeure. But what they preferred was an owner coming down, especially on some of the public projects, and saying, we're going to suspend this project for a little bit to see what happens here. On a suspension under most projects is both compensable and excusable. So all contractors want a suspension. Regardless of which way it goes, you must document your delays. Otherwise, you risk being assessed liquidated damages. So make sure you document your delays. So let's jump a few slides, Aaron. Let's jump to next one. These slides will jump after that, talk about all the notice you have to provide. Let's jump to the next one. And it's important to give that notice, otherwise, especially on a public project, you waive. Let's go to the next one. And if you waive your claim on a public project, you risk the owner, despite the fact that the owner knows there was a delay, saying, well, you never put it in writing, so it doesn't matter what we know. What matters you put in writing, the contract required you to do it. Again, the concept here is everybody agrees these delays are probably excusable. We have seen one or two people take the position that they're not, and those positions are just inexcusable, in my opinion. But the owners want them to be excusable and non-compensable, meaning you get time, but you get no money. Let's jump to the next slide. So what are some of the contractor delays we're seeing? Employees refusing to perform. We see that less now than we did 30 days ago. My fear is that we're going to see more of that if this thing blooms again. Or the inability to obtain material and equipment. I've got a project where stuff has to be shipped from a foreign country. It's specified. Who knows when that foreign country will permit their factories to go back. So that's going to delay the schedule. It's a sole source specified product. All of these things need to be delayed and documented. Next slide. So what damages are you going to incur if there is a shutdown, right? If a government shuts down or an owner shuts down, you got to secure the site. If they don't shut it down and they're trying to make a decision, you have idle manpower, maintenance of the site during the shutdown. If there's mobilization or demobilization or remobilization. And finally, if you come back later or things are forced later, you've got escalated material and labor costs. And I'm going to let Jeff and Chad talk as well about how we calculate some of these inefficiencies, because that's really what's driving it. Let's jump 2 slides. We've talked about slowdown already. Jump one more. So the next one is need to give notice. So when do we give these notices? We give the notice, one more, Aaron, please. We give these notice when there's an initial delay. Right away at the front end, you give notices. You have to look at your contract. Maybe you've got to give weekly updates of the costs. If you have to do that, make sure you do. If you fail to do it, it could be a waiver. And then finally, a post-completion delay. Or post when the delay is over, if you've got to give kind of a summary, make sure you do that. 2 concepts to follow, or quick concept to think about, is claim liquidation or pass through. So if a lower tier sub gives the general contractor notice of a delay, that general contractor would be smart to share that up with the public owner or the private owner and let that owner take a position and pass it down, act as this neutral claim conduit. Sometimes a sub who claims, again, they can't perform, but you can find 3 or 4 other replacement subs who are willing to perform, and you let them know, we think your failure to perform excuse from COVID is not a good excuse, not valid. We're going to go hire somebody else and hold you responsible for that cost. Or you put their surety on notice, suddenly they find a way to perform. Jump 2 slides, prosecution of the claim. So how do you most successfully prosecute your claim and get money? First, this is at the bottom. You have to look at, we just walked through very quickly some of the law that's available out there: impracticability of performance, impossibility of performance. Know your contract, what it permits or doesn't permit, and you align your theory to what's permitted and with the facts available to them. Lawyers, we are people who put together jigsaw puzzles where the pieces don't always fit that well. And so what we have to look at is what the picture we're trying to make, what pieces are available to us, and if maybe we can put a light blue in for where we need a dark green and will otherwise look the same. You've got to have a clear and defensible measurement of those costs. And that's what Chad and Jeff are going to talk about. But you want to have, I always say, clear math equals success. If you can give somebody a spreadsheet that follows, highlight it, to be able to show, here's what we did, here's how we did it, and math is easy to follow. You don't have to be an engineer to be able to follow it, or a mathematician, and it's easy for a judge or an arbitrator to follow. It's much easier to win. You've got to demonstrate your efforts to mitigate cost and delay. So when a subcontractor tells you they can't perform, show we called 3 people. Here's our records of calling. Here's our emails calling, looking around, seeing that we could get the best price, making sure that we reduced our damages as much as possible. Doing that makes it easy because you got to find a last minute price. We all know it's going to be high. But if you only found one, it's real easy to challenge it and say, you should have called other people to see if you could have beat that price. Well, I did. Well, what do you have to prove it? Well, I'll testify from the stand. How about some emails saying, hey, Joe, thanks for talking to me. I understand that you say you can't do this project right now. If that changes, please let me know. And have some of those emails so you can show. Finally, is when you submit these amounts of money, if you're not being paid, you can also submit lien and bond claims to secure your rights for payment. On public projects, you have 120 days from last work, and you want to make a bond claim as well. On in private work, you have 75 days from last work. So these are all things that we need to look at and put in place to make sure that you have your best path to success. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Chad, who are going to wow you guys. We are so lucky to have them to be able to help us and our clients be able to dive in and do some of this math in real time. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Good afternoon, CEA. It's Jeff Roush here, and I'm going to give some guiding steps and tips on critical tracking and record keeping because of COVID issues and the impact it has on projects. And projects are something that Chad and I know something about, having been on jobs, running jobs, company management on projects from start to finish, getting projects, off to a good start, and projects get off track. And what do we need to do when projects get off track? The delays and impacts happen, but what the impacted party does at that point is crucial to the claims avoidance, claims management, claims resolution process. So as we go through the materials here with Chad and I, again, these are guiding steps, measures to put into place with your project team, both on the front line, the on-site personnel, project management, senior management. It's important to raise the bar right now because COVID it's not been an issue that's been encountered before. So we need to have the right and the best file in place, to have the best records possible to help with the assessment and apportionment, and then ultimately you're looking to have an improved chance, the best chance for successful outcome, not just on time, but more so on money, on the damages side. So I want to just talk about, as these issues come up, some of the tips that I like to offer on this particular slide is, first of all, before, when a project gets going and when a project is going, two things: know your schedule and know the budgeted actual cost along with production rates. Knowing the schedule will help in the early identification of when things are not happening, the plan's starting to fall behind, and activities are starting to lengthen, elongate, and such. And also knowing the budgeted costs and the actual costs, that's essential to seeing variances and overruns that are happening because of a pure COVID delay, but also the discrete extra costs that Chad and I will talk about on how to capture those through your documentation program. And that documentation program is something that is it's right from the start, before, during, and after COVID issues. You may know of an anticipated problem, or you have a hunch that there is one, or there is an actual damage. It's important to trigger the documentation immediately and take it through the entire impact period. We'll use the word real time. You've heard the term real time from this firm, from the attorneys in this firm, and Chad and I are believers in real time. It's something as simple as daily reports, job cost reports, looking at them weekly, monthly, looking to see where the numbers are. The last point on this first slide is, it's still a project. It takes teamwork to do a project. So still need to communicate and try to work it out to mitigate the impacts. And as the impacted party, one of the big things is to make sure everybody knows the impact that you are encountering is real. Make everybody aware of it. You document it, and then you go for the damages after all. Next slide, please. So the time and cost components for COVID jobs, just like any other claim, but we'll show you how to break out certain items. You got schedule delay, the time side, as well as the direct and indirect cost. But in there, you have unexpected project factors. These unexpected project factors are different than what the contract documents talk about and define as a differing condition or an unforeseen condition or even a change condition. These are things that are unexpected you're having to do from a health and safety protocol standpoint, from lost time, true lost time, and then the effect on your productivity. There also may be resequencing impact for personnel, individual people, for crews. Rotation plans may be out of whack. You may have to bring in additional supervision because your one or two supervisions can't cover all this, leading all the crews. You may have to bring additional support staff on in the form of foremen or superintendents. We go next slide. So first of all, we want to make sure the first step is acknowledging and identifying the problem, but our talk's more about how to document it. So when we have a delay that's happened on the owner side, where a project does get the official suspension, we want to make sure that there's documentation, both photo, video, and inventory of where's the job at, progress-wise, what's being left there. Walk around the site, get the photos, get the inventory, and make a record of where things are. Another item here is I've seen talking to contractors that the construction administration, the CA impact, has really bogged things down even further than what it can be. With the turnaround time on design changes, getting change orders, getting shop drawings back, answers to RFIs. Good answers to RFIs back, and then the processing the payment, not just the paperwork, but actually getting the check in your hands. That's been disrupted. So when you got disruptions like that to go along with disruptions of the work, and those work disruptions are the labor inefficiencies at LOP, which we'll talk about here in a moment. We go to the next slide. So we got delays on a project where you can typically be defined as procurement or construction delays, but with the COVID-19 situation, we all need PPE on the job, but projects need PPE from a prosecution standpoint. We need to be able to progress and perform and execute the work. And when we got procurement delays and construction delays and workforce delays because of COVID, and PPE impact is much different because we're not able to perform and execute. So what I would say here when there are delays on a project, whether contractor, sub-supplier, is sit down and make everybody aware. I would encourage explaining what the impacts are, what are the options, what can be done. These are the impacts that we're going to be, that we're going to incur, that we're going to bring forth, and here's our documentation. So I'm going to turn this over to Chad now and talk about some of these fundamental, very systematic and very regimented steps that can help all parties document delays. Chad?
Hey, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the CEA today for allowing us to talk a little bit more in detail on this. I hope everyone can hear me well. As Jeff mentioned, we wanted to talk a little bit about proper documentation, and some of the impacted costs that are likely underway as we encounter our working requirements moving forward right now. Some things to consider as we talked about, projects that are progressing, that are underway, but have been suspended. We need to think about what costs are impacted there for shutting down the project, securing the project. What's our manpower? What's expanded on material, equipment, anything that's required to secure and shut down the project site to leave it in a safe order until the suspension is lifted. And think about how do we document or track all of the hours and material and equipment that goes into it. A good practice would be to set up, specific line item codes inside of your your job costing report systems. Create a shutdown matrix or a log to document those additional hours or those additional material invoices that are coming in. But as Aaron had alluded to earlier, anything that's documented and you have a nice way of putting that calculation together, those are really what these particular items are talking about. Think about your head count, how many workforce laborers are on the project at the start of the suspension, how many return to the job when the suspension is complete. Think about the job site photos, the time tracking, the date stamping, and what are the conditions that have changed now that you're shutting the project down or securing the project, and have a photo that documents what's different than what was expected to be done there. Think about your demobilization costs, recording the equipment and material that has to leave the job site for the temporary suspension, and then where does it go? Do you have stocking fees or restocking fees? Do you have temporary storage that's now required to handle these materials and equipments? Think about your security service. Are we adding any job site guards or patrols, or are we adding any security cameras to help secure the job site? And then also public safety factors. Are we maintaining a sidewalk closure, or do we have barricades that must remain in place for a period of time while the suspension is occurring? If we go to the next slide, Aaron, we could talk about some other costs that will be tracked as we move forward. Think about when you're returning to the job site, you have the remobilization costs. Just make sure that everything is detailed, that you have a backup and supporting documentation that goes into transporting those items back to the job site and then resetting up the job site as if it was in the condition it was when the suspension occurred in the first place. We talk about idle manpower and idle equipment. What work activities specifically were being worked on prior to suspension? What workforce was working on it? Is that workforce able to be displaced, or do we have idle manpower? Do we have workforce that's not able to go anywhere because of the suspension that's in place? Same thing for equipment. Are we keeping equipment on the job site? Are we moving it to different job sites? If it's staying on the job site, do we have rights to the equipment sitting there and being idle and not in use? This can go for company-owned equipment or rented equipment, and also the cost associated with if you do demobilize those pieces of equipment. Really the important thing here is that these all have impacts that really need to be tracked in a schedule. We need to understand what those schedule activities are, and then we need to understand how do we properly document that, not only in just capturing the costs and the backup that create those costs, but how do we document that in the impacted schedule? Because at some point we will certainly have to prove that our critical path has been delayed by all of these factors. Aaron, you can advance the slide.
Okay, in addition to what Chad's mentioned, there are definite other delays here with when a project timeline pushes out, you may be forced to perform the work in a different condition than what the project was bid or what your contract timeline shows. So winter conditions cost, there may be other restrictions in terms of from the agencies or public-private projects. But two most common would be a material escalation, where the costs have gone up from what you built into your bid, what is in your contract sum, and now just from a major procurement items or even just common building materials in the market pricing has gone up. So as Chad's mentioned there, having logs and spreadsheets just to track those figures, you turn it into your corresponding backup for here. And then labor escalation. If we've moved into and been the work project has shifted into a higher wage rate, what are the hours and what's the rate differential? And that's very simple computations to demonstrate and substantiate in delays. So material escalation and the labor side. If we can go to the next slide, one more I'll talk here a bit is about the loss of productivity. So that is really, Aaron mentioned the measure mile, and we've got loss of productivity because of COVID, because of social distancing and the health and safety standards that are there in place, where that does take away the efficiency of the workday by the crews, by workers, by crews, and then even so the interdependency work of other activities and other disciplines are out there. So this is we can talk an entire day about loss of productivity, but really it is keeping track of, having some record of your production rates before the pandemic. What are your impacted rates during the pandemic, and then once the production starts coming back up on the downside of the period. So it's really having a baseline of your unimpacted or your less impacted work period versus your impacted period. Now, it's easy to track the impacted period because it's happening, but use what you can on your daily reports and on your job cross reports to help establish that baseline. Also use similar projects, other similar projects with the same type of work as your baseline. So if we can go to let's go ahead to 2 slides here to the anticipated loss of productivity. So a project's been suspended and it picks back up. That's a different loss of productivity calculation, because now a job just can't pick back up and go right back at it and start putting in pipe and block and studs and flooring at the same rate. So there's a learning curve that comes with that. So if there's a suspension, we want to make sure we break up any loss of productivity segments into when it happened and when work did resume. So we'll take additional breakdown and coordination to track the tasks in the trade, but it could be upwards of 2 or 3 different types of periods of loss of productivities. So it shouldn't be, just don't think of it as one restricted period, break it down certainly. We can go ahead another slide up to the unexpected project factors. So when I speak of this here, this really would be, there's 2 costs. There's discrete lost time where you're spending 15 minutes, 30 minutes a day, getting temperature taken, hand washing, moving the crew around because of the 6-foot distancing. track that discrete time for lost time. We'd like to see that broken out and recovered in its whole. But also then there's a loss of productivity side because of the social distancing and the safety protocols. So this is a it's not all cumulative all in, but I think the best thing is to measure it and track it individually. I want to go to the next slide about cost tracking measures and have Chad talk about the workday trackers, just what that can do and what you want to be recording on that.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. And I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to run through the next couple of slides a little bit quickly here. But some thoughts on workday trackers. And this is really just how do we quantify the additional costs for unexpected factors that Jeff referenced. Think about the daily steps that are taken by your project teams now and what those impacts are for following the protocols that are in place for the new health and safety standards, and try to document how those steps have changed, what inefficiencies have been created, and how much time that is taking to adhere to those items. A good point here is that even the foreman who should be tracking the daily work activities, I suggest that they heighten their construction reports to a point that you literally could walk through hour by hour, or even 30-minute segment by 30-minute segment of every single activity that each of those workers are performing, and then what activities are added into the day because of these updated health and safety protocols. Those also can translate in a couple slides from here to our project staff as well. But other direct costs to consider: additional PPEs we've talked about, added hand sanitizing products, additional on-site temporary washing stations, sanitation costs for the job site, additional cleaning, disinfecting products. If you could advance to the next slide. So essentially, those are, really talking about the directs on the project, with labor, with material, with equipment, with the change condition, documenting those, having the calculation workbook built so that you can do such. And we will certainly stress that company documentation is essential in tracking all of these items. Also having your lower tier cost tracked with vendor receipts or slips or invoices that you can easily pull out that back up or substantiate an additional cost on the project. Go to the next slide, please. And then obviously we translate into additional overhead costs. So certainly things that are outside of the direct scope of work, but now items that are required to continue moving the project forward, such as your project staff. And in this particular slide, we're talking specifically about your superintendent's time and, tracking the discrete hours that are attributed to the change in the work requirements, how they're planning the work now, working around the social distancing requirements and additional safety and health protocols that are in place, what time is added to this person's particular day. And again, this could go to supplemental workforce or supplemental assistant superintendents or project engineers due to, if you go to the next slide, we talk a little bit more about, added meetings so that you could talk about how you're managing this additional safety protocols, additional schedule time so that you're properly updating and tracking the impacts on your schedule. So you certainly could have supplemental project staff members that are specifically needed to track the efforts that are related to COVID-19. Those efforts also relate to certain delays on a project. We talked about earlier, making sure that the schedule certainly reflects those delays. And those delays also have a general condition cost that would certainly be trackable. And again, outside of just the project staff, you also have your office overhead that you have to consider. And there's calculations on how we can allocate office overhead to particular projects, but there's certainly a cost for any delay, and outside of COVID-19 as well, for any delay that's on a project that we experience, we certainly have costs that we can allocate and calculate so that we can track these appropriately. So I think that takes us to the end of the presentation, but certainly I know we're short on time. Want to open up if there's any questions, comments, concerns, or back to CEA for any further input.
Well, would like to thank each of you, Rob, Aaron, Jeff, and Chad, for your insights. I'm presuming your presentation was so thorough that there were not any questions today. But, you know, the good practices and considerations for, you know, documenting and avoiding claims is, I think, well preserved, and we'll be sure to post this webinar to our website as another resource for members, contractors to be able to access. We'll also include, obviously, your contact information. So again, we thank you for that. Today's presentation and your ongoing support that Hahn Loescher provides to, again, CEA and our members. The upcoming webinars, educational series that we have here over the next few weeks, next week will actually be one that'll have the AGC National Chief Economist talking about implications relative to business considerations, construction, as well as then a panel of contractors who will be referencing their experiences here in the greater Cleveland area and the impacts and changes and adjustments they've made in their actual business. Then on May 27th, there will be one of, again, avoiding related COVID-19 lawsuits, and kind of a employee focused session for June 3rd relative to return to work and keeping employees safe. And I think we're also planning for June 10th, and Rob referred to this early on in the presentation today, the payroll protection program and some of the changes. We will be providing a session, I think June 10th, that relates to updates and new guidance that will be available. So as always, any questions, feel free to contact myself, Glenn Shoemate, or Courtney Smizer here at CEA. And we thank everyone for attending today. Have a great day.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.